that has signed the deal, Russia. Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has said that Russia will not support any attempts by the United States government to change this deal. Let's watch.
If now the deal is just put aside and Iran is told, you need to keep up with your obligations or we will impose sanctions again, then put yourself in North Korea's position. They are being promised the sanctions will be lifted if they give up their nuclear program. They will give it up, but no one will lift the sanctions against Pyongyang.
Does Sergei Lavrov have a point there? Because if the United States treats this kind of deal in this way, it's sending a message to other countries that it's negotiating with on nuclear issues like the DPRK and saying, you know, our word is not our bond here. Does Lavrov have a point there?
I think there is some validity to that statement. Yeah. There really is two issues here if the U.S. was to do this. One is that it would shatter international confidence in the U.S.'s ability to negotiate, and it would show that every administration could take turns and invalidate its predecessors' agreements. The second thing is it would be politically very costly and require a lot of political capital for the United States to persuade the other P5+1 members to really go back to the drawing board and review this once again. This was a very long negotiated agreement. I don't see that really happening at this point.
Right, the other point is, in Negar, this was a point that was made by the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson last week, in which he said that there is no better deal on the table. You know, if we see a better deal, well, maybe we could go along with the United States, but we don't see a better deal here.
I think that's actually one reason that President Trump's own advisors, his national security team, and quite frankly himself have come to the conclusion up until this point that what is the alternative? He promised to fix this worst deal ever, and there's nothing that they could really do. And let's not forget that the U.S. Congress just had a 60-day period to reimpose the sanctions or to basically have the U.S. unilaterally leave this agreement after President Trump refused to certify Iran's compliance, and they didn't do it. This is a Republican-controlled Congress, and it was a pretty easy process the way it's put with the NR law and everything. And that didn't happen because, quite frankly, it's also the credibility issue, but also the alternative from a practical viewpoint. What else is there to do? Because the nuclear threat is actually what the main issue is that the Europeans even and the Democrats here are focusing on.
Trita, Iran has two enrichment plants, one at Natanz, which is going to be used under the terms of this agreement for research, and the other, which is Fordo, which has been shut down. It cannot enrich uranium for the next 15 years. And what President Trump wants is a permanent restriction on Iran enriching any uranium. Is that going to be acceptable to the Iranians?
There was some attempt in the negotiations to try to make the durability of this deal, essentially the length of these restrictions longer. The United States originally wanted to be roughly 25 years. The Iranians wanted to be no more than 5 years. They ended up somewhere closer to the U.S. position, but nevertheless, the issue is this. If you try to make permanent punishment here, then Iran would essentially have to accept that it would be a different type of a country in a completely separate category. You would have non-proliferation treaty members that have nuclear weapons, such as the United States, China, and Russia. You would have NPT members that are not nuclear weapon states, such as Iran currently, and many, many other states. You would have non-NPT members, such as Israel, India, and Pakistan, North Korea now, that are not part of the NPT and do have nuclear weapons. And then you would have one single country in a fourth category, Iran, that is a member of the NPT, doesn't have nuclear weapons, but is permanently under restrictions that no other country is in. There's no way the Iranians would agree to this. They tried. It was a complete non-starter. The reason why Trump is saying that he wants this is precisely because he knows that the Iranians will say no to it. He's just trying to find a way to be able to portray himself as if he's seeking a reasonable outcome, whereas in reality, he knows that it's a non-starter and it is a fast track towards collapsing this deal.
Kaveh Afrasiabi, what kind of leverage do the Iranians have right now in countering this pressure coming from the United States? The Iranian Foreign Ministry says it will retaliate, but what can the Iranians do?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that Iran has a legal card to play and can complain against the U.S. to the UN Security Council and has very legitimate grounds to even take it to the International Court of Justice. In addition to that, we have heard from the head of Iran's atomic agency that Iran might reduce its cooperation with the UN Atomic Agency and resume its full-scale enrichment activities. And I agree with Trita Parsi that Iran cannot be treated as a second-class NPT member and has agreed to these restrictions on its NPT rights as part of a grand bargain in order to lift the sanctions. But we have seen very little of that as a result of the U.S. dragging its feet and so on. So Iran can use the mechanism within the JCPOA of the Joint Commission to complain that President Trump's latest announcement actually adds another thick layer of uncertainty over Iran and its trade policies. It inhibits foreign investment and so on, and that's a very big step against the nuclear agreement. And there's also the other scenarios, such as stopping compliance with the JCPOA altogether, which has also been threatened by Iran. But I don't think that Iran is going to go that far, and we have heard from President Rouhani that as long as the other parties stick with the terms of the agreement, Iran will remain within the JCPOA, but will take proportional reactions to the White House's very counterproductive and destructive approach.
Farhad, just one point there. If Iran does restart its centrifuges and starts enriching uranium again, it then will be in violation of the agreement.
Absolutely, yes. And the agreement calls for a dispute resolution mechanism inside it. So there is a way to settle differences. But however, if it is deemed to be a material breach, then that would initiate the whole process of potentially a snapback of where the sanctions will be gradually reimposed.
Now, what do you expect will happen then in the next 4 months? 120 days that President Trump has, basically, he's left the burden of changing this to the US Congress and the European allies.
Right. I think the inertia is really not there to revisit this deal at this point. A lot of it, I think, depends on domestic issues in the United States, as well as domestic issues in Iran with the recent uprisings. How does that affect the balance, and what does that signal to the United States, at least, as to Iran's position on the global scene? One of the things I think is the reaction that the government has taken towards these recent protests might feed into the Trump administration narrative that is basically not so much about the deal, but really saying Iran is a bad actor, thereby meriting a revisit of the deal. Now, that's not something that is obviously shared by the other P5+1 members, but it is something to note. So odds are that nothing will change at the present, but that could obviously change.
So you think there will be an attempt here to conflate these two things, the protests and the deal?
I think that falls very much into something that will be consistent with the administration's tack so far.
Negar, there is one other country that agrees with the United States position, that is Israel.
Who is not party to the deal.
Right, not party to the deal, but what kind of pressure is the United States coming under from Israel, which of course is not a fan of this deal? In fact, we heard the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu say, fix it or nix it.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu tried from day one to prevent the negotiations from going forward, to prevent the nuclear deal from basically becoming the JCPOA. Even when it was going through Congress, he did very heavy lobbying here in Washington to the point that there was even a wedge driven between him and President Obama. He didn't succeed. At the same time, the Saudis were also in parallel trying to lobby against the deal, and that didn't happen either. So I think at this point, what we've seen until now is that this deal is a done deal, and even a good portion of the Republicans, the U.S. Congress, has realized that. The president's own national security advisors have realized it. And also, I wanted to add to the issue of the protests. The protests in Iran were the main driving force was the economy. There's a lot of disenfranchised classes who didn't benefit enough from the post-deal era. So for the United States to come out and put more economic sanctions on Iranians and basically affect the population, including these protesters who are protesting against government, would give enough ammunition to the government to blame everything on the U.S. sanctions instead of fixing corruption and mismanagement that has caused the economy to go to the situation that it is right now.
Trita, there's something I want to clarify here, and that is this requirement that the United States periodically review and recertify, as it's put, this agreement. That is an internal U.S. requirement, isn't it? It's not part of the international deal.
It has nothing to do with the international deal. It's a result of Congress wishing to have an oversight over this. Some in Congress wanted this deal to be a treaty, and as a result, it would need it to be ratified by the Senate. The Obama administration did not agree with that, nor did any other country. So as a result, it ended up becoming a joint comprehensive plan of action. And the compromise then was that Congress would instead have some form of an oversight by the president having to send a quarterly report, making sure that they reported to Congress whether Iran is or is not living up to the deal and whether the deal continues to make sense for U.S. national security. This was not thought to become such a problematic thing because no one expected Donald Trump to be president. And I think from Trump's perspective, this is a recurring insult to him that every 3 months he has to certify that something Barack Obama achieved actually is working.
And Trita, what kind of sentiment is there in the U.S. Congress right now to revisit this deal and to probably change it?
I think there's a lot of rhetoric in the sense that there would still be a lot of criticism against it. And there's certainly some hardline Republicans that do want to kill it. But there's also realization that it's one thing to call for it to be killed and have it killed by someone else, so you actually are not responsible, than to actually have it sent to Congress in which their vote would kill it, and as a result, they would also own the outcome and the ensuing disaster. When faced with that, you could clearly see that the Republicans back down, because as much as they might want to see the deal killed, they don't want to be responsible for the disaster that will follow.
Kaveh, you referred earlier on to the chief negotiator for the United States in this deal, Wendy Sherman. Now, she's advised against changing this deal, which I guess is something one could expect from her. She was partly the author of this deal. She says the agreement is popular in Iran and that any change would be, to use her word, a gift to hardliners in Iran. That's internal politics in Iran, of course. But does she have a point there?
Yes, I think so. And, you know, Sherman was also extensively involved with the North Korea negotiations, so she knows her material. With respect to Iran, there's been a lot of criticism by, you know, a whole number of people, including the principalists known as the hardliners, that Iran has given up too much in this grand bargain. And now if President Trump, you know, fulfills his ultimatum, then that will probably cause a setback, political setback for the moderate President Rouhani, and the hardliner will see a historical deja vu, just like right after 9/11 when Iran cooperated with the political change in Kabul and then was rewarded with access of evil by President Bush. So this would be seen as a serious betrayal of promise by the United States that has promised, per the terms of the Algiers Agreement of the 1981, to not interfere in Iran's domestic affairs, and yet we have heard reports from Iran that the U.S. is trying to destabilize Iran as part of its aggressive New Iran strategy, and stabbing at the JCPOA is a step in that direction.
Farhad, I've got about 30 seconds left. Realistically, what do you expect to happen in the next 100, or at the end of the 120 days?
I think the deal will most likely be recertified. Again, it depends, as I said earlier, on what happens domestically in the United States. There's a lot of things going on for the Trump administration, and similarly in Iran domestically, it's a very hot button issue what's going on right now, and I think that will affect the calculus, especially with this administration.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.